You think the speed of light is just a property of light, a number nature picked, a limit for rockets, a fact you can look up. That mental picture is comfortable, and it's wrong, because in your head speed means something simple, distance over time, measured against a background that just sits there. You imagine space like a stage, time like a clock you can trust, light like a thing moving across that stage. So you expect the speed of light to depend on the situation, on the source, on you, on how fast you're moving when you measure it. If you chase light, you think you should see it slow down. If you run away from it, you think you should see it speed up. If the emitter is moving, you think that motion should add on top. That's how every other speed works. And that's why this is unsettling. You can rearrange the experiment in your mind as many ways as you want. And light refuses to cooperate. It doesn't take your speed into account. It doesn't inherit the motion of its source. It doesn't even seem to care what you call rest. You can try to patch it with excuses. People do. Maybe your instruments are tricking you. Maybe the air matters. Maybe there's some hidden medium, some invisible substance. That light is really moving through. That was the safe guess for centuries. There must be a preferred background, a true stillness, a reference frame the universe secretly respects. Except the deeper you follow that guess, the more it collapses. Because the problem isn't just that the speed of light is constant. The problem is what constant even means here. Constant compared to what? Compared to your seconds, your meters, your idea of at the same time. You think those things are universal. You think they are yours to set. You think they stay put while you measure the world. This is wrong. And Maxwell didn't uncover a cute number. He uncovered a trap hidden inside the equations of electricity and magnetism, quietly implying that something you treat as flexible isn't. Or worse, that the things you treat as fixed are. The speed of light never changes, not because light is special, but because your picture of space and time is naive. You don't notice that naivete in daily life. You can live inside it your whole life and never pay a price. But the moment you ask why the speed of light never changes, you are no longer asking about light. You are asking what reality is allowed to be. You think motion happens inside something, inside space, inside time. You picture distance as already laid out. You picture seconds already ticking. And then objects move through that setup like pieces on a board. This feels so obvious that it doesn't feel like an assumption. It feels like the starting point of thinking itself. When you say speed, you don't ask what distance is. You don't ask what time is. You divide one by the other and move on. That move hides something. Because every speed you've ever learned about quietly relies on the same backdrop, the idea that distances are the same for everyone and clocks tick the same way everywhere. You've never tested that belief. You inherited it. When you imagine two people measuring the same race, you assume they agree on how long the track is. You assume they agree on when the race starts. You assume they agree on when it ends. That agreement feels automatic, natural, unavoidable. This is wrong. Not because your measurements are sloppy, but because the agreement itself is doing the real work. Think about how rarely you question it. You don't ask whether your meter stick depends on how you're moving. You don't ask whether your clock cares about your state of motion. You treat both as neutral referees. But neutral is not something you've earned, it's something you've assumed. Every rule you know about adding speeds depends on that assumption. When a train moves and someone walks inside it, you add the walking speed to the train speed because you believe there's a shared space underneath both motions, a shared time, a shared distance. The math works because the background is fixed. But notice what you're really doing. You're anchoring motion to something you never see. You never observe absolute space. You never touch absolute time. You just act as if they exist. That act is so deeply embedded that even questioning it feels absurd until it breaks. The moment you ask why light speed never changes, you are no longer allowed to treat space and time as silent witnesses. Because if the background were truly fixed, then light would behave like everything else. It would add speeds. It would subtract speeds. It would care who's chasing it. The fact that it doesn't is not yet an explanation, but it is a warning. A warning that the stage you've been imagining may not be there at all. Or worse, that the stage rearranges itself depending on how you move across it. At this point, nothing dramatic has happened yet. No paradoxes, no warped clocks, no shrinking rulers. Just one quiet realization: your idea of motion is built on a background you never proved existed. And once that background is questioned, every rule that depends on it becomes negotiable. You expect laws to adapt to you. If you move, you expect measurements to change. If you accelerate, you expect formulas to notice. That expectation feels reasonable because it has always worked, until it didn't. Maxwell wrote equations describing electricity and magnetism, not light, not relativity, just fields changing in space and time. And buried inside those equations is a number, not introduced with ceremony, not labeled as special, just sitting there at speed. The equations don't ask who is measuring it. They don't ask how fast the source is moving. They don't ask what frame you prefer. They simply say, disturbances in these fields propagate at this speed. You might think that's incomplete, that something is missing. A reference frame, a background. But the equations don't leave a blank for it. In every other part of physics at the time, motion mattered. Velocity stacked. Frames were privileged. Rest meant something. Here, motion is irrelevant. You can try to reinterpret it. People did. Maybe the equations only work in one special frame. Maybe there's a hidden stillness they secretly assume. That move is telling. Because what's bothering you is not the number itself. It's the refusal. The refusal to acknowledge your motion. If you believed space and time were fixed, this would feel like an error. Because fixed space demands that speeds transform. They must add and subtract. They must depend on perspective. Maxwell's equations don't allow that flexibility. You can rewrite them. You can rearrange symbols. But the speed stays. It doesn't wobble. It doesn't blur. It doesn't split into your speed and my speed. This is where discomfort deepens. Because these equations weren't trying to challenge intuition. They weren't philosophical. They weren't rebellious. They were just consistent. And consistency is unforgiving. If the equations are right, then one of your assumptions is wrong. Not about light, about the stage it moves on. You can't fix this by tweaking light. You can't say it behaves unusually, because the equations don't describe light as an object at all. They describe structure. Something propagates, and the structure dictates how. So now you're cornered. 8 of the equations are wrong everywhere, but one invisible frame, or the idea that laws should change. When you move as an intuition, the universe does not share. Maxwell didn't resolve that tension. He left it hanging. And hanging tensions don't disappear. They demand rescue. The next move was predictable, human, and desperate. When intuition is threatened, it doesn't surrender. It compromises. If Maxwell's equations won't change with your motion, then maybe you are moving through something else, something still, something real, something that defines true rest. That idea felt safe because it preserves the background. Space stays space, time stays time. Speeds behave again. Light in this picture is no longer strange. It's just a wave. And like every wave, it must move through something. Water waves need water. Sound waves need air. So light must need a medium too. They called it the ether. Not a wild speculation, a conservative. A way to keep centuries of intuition intact. The ether was supposed to be everywhere, filling all space. Perfectly rigid to support fast waves. Perfectly transparent so you never notice it. And crucially, at rest. Finally, a background you could trust. If the ether exists, Maxwell's equations make sense again. They describe waves moving through a medium at a fixed speed. Your motion just changes how you move through that medium. Comfort returns. Except reality doesn't care about comfort. If the ether is real, then motion through it should be detectable. You should feel an ether wind. Light moving along the wind should behave differently from light moving across it. So physicists looked. They didn't look carelessly. They looked obsessively, with interferometers designed to amplify the smallest difference. And the result was silence. No drift, no wind, no direction that behaved differently. Every orientation gave the same speed. This is the moment where excuses thin out. You can say the ether is dragged along with Earth, but then stars should behave differently. They don't. You can say the ether contracts instruments, but now you're modifying matter to save an invisible medium. Each patch makes the ether less physical and more metaphysical. Eventually, the idea collapses under its own weight. Not because anyone disproved the ether directly, but because it stopped explaining anything. A background that cannot be detected cannot define motion, and cannot be interacted with is not a background. It's a story. And once that story fails, something unsettling remains. Maxwell's equations were right. The speed was real. But there was no stillness underneath it. No absolute rest, no hidden frame to rescue intuition. Which means the problem was never light. The problem was the need for a background at all. And now there's nowhere left to hide it. You still have one refuge left. Even if space has no preferred rest, even if motion is relative, you can still cling to time. You assume everyone agrees on now, not approximately, not philosophically, operationally. You believe two events either happen at the same time or they don't, and that this fact exists independently of who observes it. This belief feels unshakable because it hides inside language, before physics, before measurement. But this is where the trap closes. Imagine two lightning strikes hitting opposite ends of a long train platform. You're standing in the middle of the platform, motionless relative to it. Light from both strikes reaches you at the same moment. You conclude they happened simultaneously. Now imagine someone standing in the middle of a train moving past the platform. Light from the front strike has to chase them. Light from the rear strike moves toward them. They receive one flash before the other. You can try to correct for this. You can say, they just moved. But correction requires assumptions. Assumptions about how fast light travels. Assumptions about distance. Assumptions about what clocks mean when they're moving. And this is where you lose control. If light speed is the same for everyone, not approximately, but exactly, then both observers are using the same rule. No one is mistaken. No one is privileged. The only thing that can give way is simultaneity itself. This is not a trick, not a perception issue, not a delay in signals. It's a structural conflict. If now we're universal, then light would have to change speed to satisfy everyone, but it doesn't. So now fractures. Two events can be simultaneous for you, and not simultaneous for someone else, without contradiction. This is where intuition panics. Because you've been treating time as a shared river, flowing uniformly everywhere. But rivers don't branch this way. So you try to hold on to something else. Maybe clocks slow down. Maybe motion affects mechanisms. But the problem isn't the clocks. The problem is that at the same time was never guaranteed to survive. Once you demand a constant speed for light, you are forced to trade it for something else. And what you trade is not precision. It's agreement. Time is no longer a background everyone inhabits together. It becomes relational, defined by how motion and light connect events. You don't get to ask which one is really now. That question assumes what just failed. This is the moment where physics stops describing events in time and starts describing time between events. And from here on, nothing that depended on a universal now will remain intact. At this point, calling it the speed of light is misleading, because nothing you've uncovered so far depends on light behaving strangely. Light isn't negotiating. It isn't adapting. It isn't reacting. Everything else is. You were trained to think of speed as motion through space over time. Something secondary, something measured after the fact. But what you're seeing now is the reverse. The number stays fixed because space and time bend around it. That should bother you. Because it means C is not describing how fast something goes. It's describing how space and time relate to each other. Think about the units, meters per second. You treat that as distance divided by time. But it can also be read the other way around. How much space corresponds to a unit of time? A conversion rate, like centimeters per inch. Not a speed. A bridge. You don't ask why there are 2.54 centimeters in an inch. You accept that it defines how two ways of measuring length connect. C plays that role between space and time. Tells you how much space fits into a second, or how much time fits into a meter. Once you see it this way, the constancy stops being mysterious. It would be strange if it weren't constant. If different observers had different values of C, they would be living in different geometries, different conversions, different realities. But physics doesn't allow that fragmentation. Instead, it sacrifices the things you thought were more solid: simultaneity, length, duration. Those were negotiable. This is not. Light just happens to ride this structure perfectly. It moves at exactly 1 unit of space-time conversion because it has no mass to slow it down. But even that statement is almost secondary. The deeper truth is this: the universe does not start with space and time and then let things move inside them. It starts with a rule about how events can be related, a maximum rate at which cause and effect can propagate. That rule is C. Everything else rearranges itself to obey it. You keep calling it a speed because you don't have a better word. But what it really is a structural constant of reality, a boundary condition on how the universe is allowed to exist. And once you accept that, the last intuition you're holding on to quietly dissolves. Shall I expand the next chapter? Maxwell was not trying to rewrite reality. That matters. He wasn't questioning space. He wasn't doubting time. He wasn't searching for philosophical limits. He was organizing electricity and magnetism, cleaning up a mess of experiments, making the equations agree. And in doing that, he stumbled into something deeper than intention. His equations didn't say light moves at this speed relative to something. They just said it moves at this speed. No anchor, no reference, no appeal to a background. That should have been impossible, because for centuries, physics had relied on an unspoken promise that there exists a stable arena where laws play out, a stage that doesn't move, doesn't bend, doesn't argue back. Maxwell's equations quietly break that promise. They don't shout. They don't warn you. They simply refuse to name the stage. And once that refusal is taken seriously, the universe stops offering you a fixed viewpoint. There is no master clock ticking behind the scenes, no universal ruler stretched across existence, no real length or true duration waiting to be revealed. Only relationships. Only how events connect through light. Only how causality carves paths through space-time. This is the uncomfortable endpoint. Not that reality is unknowable, but that it is not built around you. Your intuition evolved for slow speeds, short distances, shared clocks. It was never designed to be a judge of the universe's architecture. Maxwell exposed that architecture without meaning to. He showed that the universe enforces consistency not by making laws observer-dependent, but by making observers part of the law. You don't measure reality from the outside. You participate in its geometry. And the speed of light never changes because it is not responding to motion. Motion is responding to it. That number is not a limit added to reality. It is a statement about what reality can be. A statement that says there is a maximum way for events to be linked, a deepest rule for how here can influence there. Everything else, space, time, motion, is negotiable. You don't leave with a picture you can hold. You leave without the picture you trusted. And that absence is not a failure of understanding. It is the shape of the truth Maxwell uncovered without ever setting out to look for it.